Look, these are all things we have. I'm going to read a few of the samples, but look at this. These are all, each line is something that we did. Nobody did that before. And it's big stuff, too. Look, we have the hottest country in the world.
Nothing like a visual aid and then tossing that over. Welcome back. That was President Trump earlier this afternoon with an interesting way of touting his accomplishments on this, the first anniversary of his second term in office. One that has been marked by a massive and historic expansion of his power as president. We mentioned some of this, but it bears repeating. You've lived it, you know. In the last 12 months, President Trump has implemented sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization. We're waiting on the Supreme Court to rule if some of those are specifically legal or not. He sent the National Guard to major American cities against the demands or wishes of local leaders. And he has freed thousands of government workers, fired them, and dismantled federal agencies, publicly directed by the Department of Justice to go after political adversaries, and that has included New York's Attorney General Letitia James, former FBI Director James Comey, Senator Adam Schiff, and made massive changes to the country's immigration system, including moving to end the long-standing practice of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. That's still before the High Court. President Trump has repeatedly bypassed Congress, signing 229 executive orders in 365 days. Now, for comparison, President Biden signed 77 executive orders during his first year. President Trump only signed 55 executive orders during the first year of his first term, and the only modern president to have signed more EOs in the first term of a presidency was FDR, who signed 381 executive orders to mobilize the country for World War II, a very different time and place. Now, joining me now is presidential historian and professor of history at Rice University in Texas, Douglas Brinkley. So good to see you, Douglas. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And what do you make of the speed and the scope at which President Trump seems to be expanding executive power in what is supposed to be three co-equal branches? He has really puffed up and expanded the range and reach of the presidency. What is your take on that?
Well, that Donald Trump went at breakneck speed, following the guidebook of the Heritage Foundation's, 2025 manual, and just is tripling and quadrupling down on this is the era of extreme presidential power. I think it's the main takeaway from 2025. It's just not the number of EOs you saw there. It's just the ones he's decided to do, like, reopening the wound of January 6th and pardoning insurrectionists. That was on day one. And many of these just aren't ever going to stick. If a Democrat became president and, the next cycle, a lot of these will just disappear, like the bad idea of Trump's name on the Kennedy Center. And we can chuckle about something like that. But this is a mad dog approach to presidential power. Donald Trump believes the line Nixon told David Frost on BBC, if the president does it, it must be legal. He thinks he's above the law as president. He has a sympathetic Supreme Court in which he was first term Trump, got three of them on there. And he doesn't have much interest in Congress. I think the success of the big, beautiful bill is the concrete success of 2025. But otherwise, it's just Trump firing in all directions in willy-nilly fashion. And we still don't know what sticks or what doesn't stick. But it sure leads to a very chaotic terrain in America.
And when we look at some of the prominent differences between the first term and how he approached the office this time around, one thing we notice is that he was surrounded by people in the first term, a number of them, who were telling him things he could not do, advising him about the law, advising him about the norms of Washington. This time, it seems that those who are close to him and influencing his thinking are not putting any brakes on. How significant do you think that staffing change is in the way the president is governing?
What a great question. I do think that's the big difference. Plus, first time Trump, he hadn't had the 34 felony charges, meaning he wasn't as angry at what he saw as the deep state. It became more rhetorical. We're going to drain the swamp, on and on. Trump now has learned some McNuggets of history, and he's actually behaving like a 19th century expansionist president. I mean, the gunboat diplomacy and the going into Venezuela like he has done, the idea that of the new Trump-Monroe doctrine, his William McKinley-esque belief in tariffs against the thinking of all economists, and most significantly of all, his breaking of the cardinal rule of U.S. foreign policy from Harry Truman, even down to first-term Trump, was NATO supremacy. Keep that alliance going militarily, economically, politically, culturally. NATO is the core of America's existence in the world. And he now is going to Davos, having all of the NATO allies loathing the United States, mistrusting us, and ostensibly what he didn't talk about today, pocket issues, grocery prices, inflation, all of the reasons he was elected. He now says he's going to talk about the home affordability issue in Davos while the Greenland flap's going on. And it is just mind-boggling that he's able to just generate kind of crazy whiplash headlines every day for going oddly in another direction, then backing off, then doubling down. It's just a foreign policy of confusion and antiquated 19th century thinking.
Well, I wish we could talk about more because I would really enjoy digging into a number of other topics. Sadly, time is vanishing today. Douglas, thank you for being here. We so appreciate it, and we will look for some of your insights down the road as well.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.